Well, you guys may recall a few weeks ago, I made the comment that I was going to spend more time on family issues. The family is really under attack right now. And so I'm going to go back and spend a little more time on family issues and even individual issues. Some of those items are not addressed real often, and sometimes it's because it can be a little bit uncomfortable. 2 weeks ago, I spent time talking about specifically the responsibility of the husband, primarily, and addressed another area primarily by request. And today we're going to follow up, and we're going to talk about the virtually the same topic, but from the other side. We're going to continue to talk about marriage, but we're going to talk a little bit about the responsibility of the wife. And with that being said, I will go back and address a few items that really affect both that I really didn't address last time. I'm going to start off in Matthew chapter 19. This is a passage that the majority of us are very familiar with. Matthew 19, starting in verse 4. I'm going to rely on this mic because I have no mic today. Matthew 19, starting in verse 4. And he answered and he said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, For this cause shall man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Now, the majority of us have heard this passage time and time again, especially when we oftentimes will go to a marriage ceremony. But the idea very clearly is that once a man and a woman marry, they become husband and wife. They are establishing a new family. Now, certainly the role of a wife is going to become very different than an unmarried woman due to the responsibility and her role. And then that role as a wife would vary and change over time even more as she's blessed to have children. And most of you probably realize that having one child is different than having four. So we see that as one becomes a wife and then becomes a mother of a child and then more children, we see this role continues to change over time. And yet through all of these changes with her family structure or the role, and even between the husband and the wife over the years, through all those good times and bad times, the idea is they establish a permanent, unbreakable bond. And that's really what we find there in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the responsibilities of a wife in a godly home. Now, I know this has become a very controversial subject today as it deals with what many would really call a politically incorrect topic. And much of our society has rejected the God-given roles regarding both husbands and wives. I think we've found it very prominent today in society that many today do not want to define roles for either men or for women. Both feminism and modernism have really attempted to degrade wives that choose to stay at home and to work and to raise their family. And many even believe and teach that the wives are inferior to their husbands or of a lesser importance to the family unit if they choose to stay and to work at home and to raise their children. Now here's the thing, as we go back, and I mentioned that society today wants to reject roles within all regards. As we go back and we begin to talk about these different words, and most of us are familiar with words like women, men, husbands, and wives, as we begin to talk about those, society has really tried to feminize the male role while at the same time promoting masculine traits for women. And they've been very successful, as a matter of fact. Now let me say this, I will have to say, as a man and a husband, I would say that's one of the things that I most admire in my wife is her feminine qualities. Probably the majority of us here as men, when we chose our wives and we were looking for brides, that's one of the things probably that we were looking for. Well, the biblical and feminine role of the wife is not degrading to women, even though that's pretty much the idea from society around us. And as we noted 2 weeks ago when we were dealing with the husband, she is to be honored. She is to be treated with respect as his lifelong partner in the marriage bond, and that's because of the role that she has. The biblical role of the wife is important in establishing the stability of the home. And I would say in many regards, oftentimes, the basis of the home and how it functions and how everything goes for the wives that stay at home with children, much of that is dependent on her. Why? Well, because the husband oftentimes is gone. So she is there to direct and to guide. I can remember oftentimes when I was younger, of course I wasn't a Christian, my mom would direct and guide the best of her ability. She used a cake spatula usually. And when I wouldn't behave, she would say, well, wait till your father gets home. He'll take care of what I cannot. But for the most part, I had fear for and respect for my mother. And I knew that if I didn't pay attention, I was going to get it when my dad got back home. So a wife and mother in the home does much to set the stability of the atmosphere. Now, with all that in mind, let's begin to talk about some major points regarding the role of wives and mothers in a godly home. I'm going to go back and spend a little bit of time talking about exactly what I was telling husbands 2 weeks ago. Regardless of the image portrayed by society, the role of the wife is a position of honor. Now, regardless of what society states or what is really politically correct, the God-given role and duties of a Christian wife and mother are honorable. And without doubt, Christians should have the greatest marriages in society. If we were to compare Christians today and their marriages to those around us, what we should find, is that we have the most stable, the most content, and the happiest marriages of all. What is the truth of the matter, and why is it we're spending time talking about responsibility of husbands and wives? The reality of the matter is although it is a little bit better within the churches of Christ, we have a number of the exact same issues that we find in the world around us. And why is that? Well, because the world in many ways has infiltrated not only the individual, but congregations in general. And that's why we have to come back and address some of these things. Now, as we noted back in our previous lesson, I'm going to go on over to 1 Peter 3:7. We looked at this regarding husbands. It speaks of the husband's admiration and the honor that he has regarding his wife. Notice 1 Peter 3:7. Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Now, I spent a lot more time on this passage last time, 2 weeks ago, with the husbands. But the idea really is that the honoring of the role of the wife is expected by Christian husbands, and it should be expected by those who are wives. Matter of fact, in Proverbs 18:22, it says this, whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing and obtaineth favor of the Lord. When I wasn't a Christian, my wife was still very spiritually minded. Okay? And if not for my wife being spiritually minded, I would not have eventually been spiritually minded. And most likely, I would not have become a Christian. That's the truth of the matter. And I say that because a wife who desires to please God is going to have an impact on both her husband and her family. And because of that, when she is carrying out this God-given role, she is to be honored. Now we're going to talk about the point that many people have a problem with. And we're going to try to lay this out a little bit differently. But the Bible does teach that the wife is to be in submission to her husband. Now, a lot of people have a problem when they hear this word submission. I'm not quite sure why. All Christians are in submission to the will of God, and yet I don't ever look at that as it making me inferior or less than anyone else. Let's go on over to Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to give you some passages, and then I'm going to give you a real-life understanding of how this works. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. We'll read down to verse 24. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. And therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Now again, this is not about the equality of men and women in general. I'm specifically referring to the marriage bond. Now I'm not going to go in and address this, but I do want to mention, I have literally listened to preachers who have talked about how men could never be in subjection to any woman, even outside the home, even within the workplace. I've actually listened to preachers say that it is sinful for a man to have a female as a boss. Guys, we are talking about the marriage bond. We are not talking about the secular workplace. My current boss is a male, but if he were a female, the fact that I would be in subjection to her because of her, whatever her occupation is there at the building, that has nothing to do with what the Bible is talking about regarding marriage. We are talking about the marriage bond. Okay? There is an establishment within the marriage for roles. Roles for men, roles for women. Again, it has nothing to do with equality, and I'm going to show you that idea here in a minute. Let me give you a couple of passages confirming what we've already learned in Ephesians chapter 5. Because if you have pushback regarding what we just read in Ephesians 5, you're going to have serious problem with some other passages. Colossians 3:18, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as it is fit in the Lord. Now you may say, well, how exactly is it fit in the Lord? Well, you need to go back and study the rest of the scriptures, delegating and talking about how your marriage is to function, how roles are to be carried out. That's how it is fit in the Lord. Titus 2:5 says this, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their, notice this, own husbands. We're talking about the marriage bond here, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Again, we're talking about roles within the marriage bond. Now I'm going to go over to 1 Peter 3, verse 1 through 6. He basically teaches the same thing, and then he goes back to the Old Testament to confirm we even have this by example. 1 Peter 3, starting in verse 1. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation, that word means manner of life, of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on apparel. Let me pause for a second. He is not downgrading the doing of your hair and all that. He's saying that is not what the focus is to be on. We're talking about the inner person and how you behave. And he goes on, but let it be the hidden man of the heart and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. All right, so we're talking about the wife being submissive or in subjection to the husband. Now let's begin to get a little breakdown on this. Guys, it is logical within the marriage bond. You cannot have two leaders. How many of you guys have ever tried to have two leaders and they all want to do something completely different? That does not function. Okay, so logically we cannot have two leaders within the marriage bond. The marriage is made up of two people, and there are going to be times when those two people will have a disagreement, right? Some people say, well, we'll just vote on it. What happens if you got two people and they vote on it, they vote differently? Yes, I want to. No, I don't want to. That's a tie. Let's vote again. You guys remember rock, paper, scissors? No, it doesn't work. So there has to be a leader. We get that logically. Now let me give you a real-life example. Where I work, I have a boss. Okay, and my boss and I are both equal as people. However, our roles are completely different. And in cases where an ultimate decision must be made and I would disagree with him, I defer to his decision. Why? That is how the structure is set up where I work. Right? I am in submission to him. Now, here's what's interesting, guys. The majority of the time, he and I agree on everything. It is very rare that we ever have a disagreement. But if there's a disagreement between him and I defer to his decision. And guys, he bears the burden of responsibility on his shoulder for that decision. Now, I may tell him, hey, I totally disagree with this. However, I have always said, that's your decision to make. That's the role that I have. And I understand that, and I carry that role out. Now, again, very rarely do we ever disagree. Well, just as in a marriage, the frequency of this occurring is usually, in a faithful marriage, is usually relatively very small. I began to go back and to try to think about when was the last time my wife and I had a disagreement over something where I had to say, I hear what you're saying, but we're not doing it that way. I can't recall the last time. And you may say, well, why is that? Well, the majority of the time when there's ever a big decision to be made, my wife and I, like probably many of you, will sit and discuss all the aspects of that. Why? Well, I have to have a full understanding of what it is we're making a decision on, so that if need be, if we don't come to an agreement on how to make a decision, I have to make that decision. The burden of responsibility is on me. And so I value her input just as much as she, I hope, values my input. Now, again, with that being said, I am to be the leader of the home, Ephesians 5:23. And so in the case where we may not disagree, but a decision has to be made, I will make that decision, and I alone bear the responsibility of that decision making. If I'm wrong, it's on my shoulders. And so a godly husband, he's going to value the input of his wife, and in most cases, they probably are going to agree 100% on the decision that they're going. But if there is a disagreement between the two, he's got to bear the responsibility of that. Now, with talking about the idea of submission, what we want to do is go back, and both husbands and wives need to seek to understand this idea of submission. Again, Ephesians 5:22 speaks of wives being in submission to their husbands as to the Lord. Guys, wives are not the only ones who submit themselves to the Lord. And so if we keep in mind how it is we submit ourselves to the Lord, then that is going to make it much easier for us to have the mindset within the marriage bond from both the standpoint of giving and receiving. And I think that's very important. And I think when that is done, I think there's there's very few problems related to the role between the husband and the wife and the decision making that needs to be done. Now, there are a number of reasons why people today are pushing against this idea of the role of submission. I think the fault lies not only with, some people like to blame the women. It's not just the women. The fault lies with both men and women. It's oftentimes brought on by ungodly and arrogant, lazy, and selfish attitudes. And sometimes the women, unfortunately, they lead because men do not step up to lead. When many women want the husband to lead the home as he's supposed to, and yet for many reasons he will not. And so she unfortunately oftentimes is forced and then takes it upon herself. Probably many of you know marriages where it is a very dysfunctional marriage. The husband may have a number of issues going on, may not be a faithful Christian. And what does she have to do? She's placed in the position where she has to be the one who has to lead within the marriage. The husband is supposed to lead the home. She is supposed to be submissive to the husband. The only exception to this submission within the marriage bond is when it would violate God's law. Listen to Acts 5:29. Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. God comes first within our marriage relationship, okay? If a husband expects his wife to do something that is not allowed, or he does not allow her to do something which is commanded, she is to obey God rather than him. Now, that doesn't carry over or dismiss any of the other obligations that she has, but let me give you an example. If I were to tell my wife, which she's not here, she's not forsaking, she is sick. If I were to tell my wife, you cannot go to worship, I can tell you, I guarantee you, like probably every other wife in here, what she's going to do. She's going to pick up her keys and look at me and give me that and just walk out the door. And she's going to come to worship, right? So she realizes, and she would probably say, I can hear it in my mind right now, you don't have the authority to tell me what I can and cannot do when God has already commanded it. And I would say that's probably exactly what every wife in here would probably say, right? She has an understanding of that. However, that doesn't mean that when she comes back home, she can say, well, I didn't obey you earlier, so I'm not going to be submissive to you in other areas today. With that being said, I'm going to address that in a minute. There are going to be some other areas in our marriage, I guarantee you, that are going to be impacted. Why is that? Well, because she doesn't feel very, very emotionally close to me. So, we'll address that when we get there. But she is to be in a role of submission to the husband. Now again, in a godly marriage, I would say it's not going to be very often where a wife and a husband are going to disagree on the direction in which they are going. Now, it may be in areas where she has very little knowledge, or could be, guys, it could be let me tell you a little something here. I don't pay bills at my house. You guys know I don't even know how much money's in my bank account. I don't even know. I know that I have enough money every week to put gas in my car when I go to work back and forth, and I know that we have enough to buy for food, but I honestly have no idea. And so when it comes to financial matters, I have to normally go ask my wife, hey, how much is in the bank account? Are we allowed to get this, or can we do that? Because I don't keep track of that. It's just not one of those things that I do. That's how we've chose to do it within our house, right? I trust her, She's home throughout the day. She can deal with all that stuff. So there are times, though, where I have to go get that information so that I can make a decision. But that doesn't mean that she's not submissive to me because she's paying the bills. I'm still in charge of how we do things. She has to be submissive, but here's another point. As she's carrying out that role of submission, my wife, like many wives, have chosen to stay and work out of the home. She is a keeper of the home. Now, we talked last week when I was regarding husbands, we talked about women who are not working outside the home. And we addressed a number of reasons why that might be taking place. Let's look at the passages here as we move on. I'm going to go over to Titus 2:5. To be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Now, if you look up that phrase, keepers at home, it's actually one word, oikuros, and it actually says, according to the Strong's there, a guard, or beware, a stayer at home, and the idea is it is somebody who is domestically inclined. The point is she is the keeper, she is the guardian of the home. Now, I can tell you, when I was young, my mom, she did not work at home. She had a business until about the age of 10, I think, or 11, at which time we moved to the farm, and she became a stay-at-home mother, okay? And I can remember coming home, and usually when I walked in the door, my mom was in the kitchen. My mom was one of those that never stopped, constantly cleaning, working. She's still like that today. She was one who was constantly keeping the home. She was the guardian, the keeper of the house. 1 Timothy 5:14. I will therefore that younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. You look at this phrase here, guide the house. How many of you guys have ever heard the phrase, the queen of the castle? That's kind of the idea that we have here. The point is that she cares for and she directs the needs within the home. There is very few times where when I come home, the things that are needed within the house are not already taken care of, right? Things that I oftentimes do not think about because I am, in my secular workplace, I am gone during the day. I don't realize that we're out of this or out of that. But my wife takes care of all that. She is the keeper and the guide of the house. She's the one that pretty much monitors all of those activities that are taking place. Guys, if go on over to Proverbs chapter 31. Now, we read from here as we opened up this sermon. And we have the description here of the virtuous woman. Notice what it says in Proverbs 31, verse 27 through 29. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. When we go back and begin to look at the scriptures, God's plan is that the wife would take care of the home and the family, including tending to her children and the needs of the home. It gives me great comfort during the day when I am gone to know that my wife is there and that she can deal with whatever the issues are of the home while I am not there. And so I work outside the home while she works inside the home. Now, I know that society oftentimes shames this arrangement. The only time that it is shameful is when a wife chooses to work at home and she is not actually working at home. She's not caring for the responsibilities of the family. How many of you guys have heard the mocking phrase, she's at home on the couch eating bonbons, right? Why do people say stuff like that? Well, there are wives, and I assume men, who decided to stay at home while their wives work, who they've agreed to stay at home and to work, and they're not actually working, right? You come home, the house is destroyed, it's not taken care of, so forth. So that's the only time that this situation of a wife staying at home to work is actually shameful, even though society tries to make it sound like it's less than it ought to be. Well, if you've been blessed to stay at home or to choose to stay at home as a wife and a mother, you need to do your best to fulfill that role. And part of that is in respect to your husband and the fact that there was this allowance or ability for you to stay home to actually work while he's working in a secular workplace. Now, we'll talk about respect here in a few minutes. Let me point something out. You guys probably recall, I told you 2 weeks ago, as I was preparing to speak on the role of husbands, I went and asked married women with children in my secular workplace, How many of them would continue to work outside the home if their husband's salary was enough for them to live comfortably? I did not have one female with children who was married who said, yes, I would continue to work outside the home. Every one of them that I asked said I would choose to stay at home and to be a stay-at-home mother. And one in particular, although she never said it, I could hear the words of resentment in the fact that she was forced to be the breadwinner and to take care of the children and her husband. Because she said, I've always made more money than my husband. He doesn't hold a job. He doesn't provide, so I have to do it. And there was a lot of resentment. She said, I would much rather be at home taking care of my children and taking care of the house. She said, because here's what happens now. I work all day because I'm the breadwinner, and guess what happens when I come home? I still have to do everything in the house. So I have long work days. Well, why do I say all that? Well, there are a lot of women who actually want the biblical role that we find within the Scriptures to stay at home and to care for their family. And I know, contrary to political correctness, that many women want this lifestyle. Now, we've already addressed some of the reasons why women may not choose that. But for the most part, of all of the women, if that poll was representative, all of the women I spoke to wanted to stay home and take care of their children. They wanted to take care of their house while their husbands went out and provided for them. Now, here's the question. Can men learn these things? And can women learn to work outside the home? And is it sometimes a necessity? When I was about 12, my mom and my dad began to make me cook. I had to cook all the time. And then I also had to learn how to do clothes and iron and sew. And I can remember my mom saying, now, you don't need a woman for anything, right? You know how to cook, you know how to clean, you can do all of that. Just as a woman can learn to go out and to work on a car, right? I'm not talking stereotypes. There's many of these things that we need to know how to do. But I think as you go back and you'll learn, it's not as natural as the patterns and roles that God had instituted within the Scriptures. It oftentimes will lead to unneeded temptations and marriage problems. There's a few things I'd like to talk about on that, but I'm not going to. I'm gonna go ahead and leave that out. Simply, I have seen, working in a manufacturing setting, Larry will probably shake his head back there. I've seen a number of things occur with women in the workforce that probably would not have occurred had they not been working in that type of setting. And it had great impact on marriages. Many of them have come to an end because of the things that have taken place. So sometimes there are unneeded temptations when women have to enter the workforce. Let me say this, it works both ways. The same thing happens with men. Many of us as men have been tempted due to where we're working. I only point that out to say that sometimes we create or we place ourselves in areas where there is unneeded temptation. You may say, well, what about working wives then? We addressed this a few weeks ago. She is to be a keeper of the home, but for many reasons, wives have decided to work outside of the home, or they've been forced to work outside of the home so that they can, for whatever needs be, take care of financial obligations and so forth. That doesn't, though, remove her role as the keeper of the home, any more than me working outside of the home removes my role as a husband and a father. Okay? Now let's talk a little bit about her loving her husband and family. That is part of her role as a wife and mother. Now, certainly love is needed in a marriage relationship if it's going to thrive. Now, we actually address this with the husbands. Very interesting when you go back and you begin to look at scriptures that the husband is told multiple times within the scriptures that he is to love his wife. Some examples would be over in Ephesians 5:25 through 33, multiple times just in that passage. Colossians 3:19, 1 Peter 3:7, and there's a number of other verses. And I find it very interesting that the wife is told to love her husband only once. Now, if you go over and you look at Titus 2:4, it says that wives are to love their husbands. It's interesting the word chosen here. The word for love here is the word phileo. It is the type of love that you find expressed between family and close companions. And maybe the reason she's only told to love her husband once as we look through the scriptures is because generally women understand how to love a whole lot better than men do. As a matter of fact, they know how to care and to love others, and they do it extremely well. Oftentimes, they'll even sacrifice for their friends and their families unconditionally, and oftentimes they do it unappreciated. And I think many of you will probably be willing to admit that women do a much better job oftentimes loving their friends and companions and their family, right? I don't think there's a whole lot of question about that. But most men have to learn how to love their wives, whereas for many women it seems to come very natural. Unfortunately, we find within the marriage bond sometimes love is not being carried out as God had intended. Well, I began to go back and do some research. I read a number of articles, a number of polls, and I kind of combined all of that really into this next kind of point that I'm going to look at. Why is it then that the love within the marriage bond is oftentimes not meeting the biblical requirements? I'm going to break it down into two areas. First, I'm going to talk about the physical aspect of intimacy. Guys, I'll always be very careful with what I say here. When I went back and looked at the polls that they had given to married men and women, here's what I found. 40% of married men who were polled said they desired more physical intimacy within their marriage. And you might say, well, that's to be expected. They're men. Well, I also found that 22% of married women said the exact same thing. Now you may say 40%, 22%, that's not that bad. Guys, if you add that together, what that tells us is that over 60% of marriages have at least one person within that marriage relationship who is unhappy with the frequency of intimacy within that marriage. Many men are wondering, and probably many wives are wondering, why their marriage does not have the intimacy that it should. Well, that leads us to the second point. The reason that the intimacy may not be as frequent or as good as it should be is because of the second point, which is the emotional aspect of intimacy. Again, why is intimacy oftentimes lacking? Many men are asking this, and many women are asking it. I went back and I actually began to read an article by it was done by a mother and wife, and she said, Guys are asking, why is the intimacy lacking in our marriages? She said, I spoke with a few of my friends, and she said, for the husbands that really want to know, I'm going to put it here for you. So, men, let's listen up, and then hopefully you'll have some understanding why intimacy is lacking in your marriage. This would also apply in some areas to men also, or to women also. Here's the number one reason. Why is the intimacy within our marriage not where it ought to be? Number one reason. She said, you know what? Many of us wives don't feel intimately connected to our husbands. We don't feel close to our husbands. While the husbands feel more connected to their wives through physical intimacy, wives need to connect on an emotional level first. In 1 Peter 3:7, we talked about this really last week. We are to dwell with our wives according to knowledge. Each woman obviously is different. I only have one wife, but I need to have an understanding of how do I emotionally connect to my wife. And my wife is going to be different than somebody else's wife. So there's no one article that says just do this one thing and that will solve your intimacy problems or your emotional closeness problems. All of our wives are different, and the areas in which we have to address or change to be emotionally connected to our wives is going to vary. But she said the number one reason that majority of women or men are having these intimacy issues are because we don't feel intimately close with you, or emotionally close, to you. Number two, she said, the number two reason why women oftentimes are not meeting the intimate needs of their husbands, she said, we just don't feel very attractive. Well, it's interesting. Certainly our wives need to have affirmation from their husbands that they are still attracted to them. And she went on and basically said, as a wife and a mother, my body has changed since having kids, and I know it. But I still compare myself, unfortunately, to the distorted images of the world. And within my mind, I think that my husband probably doesn't find me attractive. And so it's hard for me to be emotionally close and feel intimately close with my husband when I don't feel that he desires me. So here's the thing, guys. Words are not enough. She needs to know by the look in your eyes. If we keep our eyes on our wives, our heart will follow it. She needs to have the idea that if there's 100 other women in the room, that you're not going to look at any of them other than, or the way that you look at her. You have eyes only for her. She said, I and many wives do not feel attractive to our spouses. Here was the third reason she gave. She said physical desire for intimacy, oftentimes for females, is not quite as strong as males. Now, that's a general rule. It's not always the case. It varies both sides. This problem is twofold because she needs to understand her husband's intimate needs while he, at the same time, needs to understand her emotional needs. And if he will try to meet her needs first, I think what you will find is that it may help the situation. What I'm saying is meet her emotional needs before you even worry about your intimate needs with her, and hopefully that will solve some of that situation. Here was the fourth one that she said, and I think this is true. Many of us have seen this within our marriages. So for those who are maybe newlyweds or have new children, here's the number 4 reason that her and a host of other married moms say that intimacy lacks in her marriage. Unfortunately, I'm focused more on being a mom than I am a wife. You may say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, that's extremely common, especially for those that have newborns and toddlers. I would say that it is very hard for a wife to think of herself as an attractive wife when all throughout the day, all she has done is had baby talk with little 2-year-olds running around and cleaning up after them and picking their toys up and working all day doing that and caring for the kids. Then all of a sudden her husband comes home and she's supposed to switch from the mother mode in sweatpants and a sweatshirt who's cleaned all day and chased around and wiped up dirty kids running around, and she's supposed to change into wife mode and feel attractive. So she said, I feel more like a mom than I do a wife, and so very hard for me to oftentimes be in that position where I desire that. Guys, sometimes here's what happens. Our roles as wives and even husbands get lost, and that is not good. I'm not going to go back and talk about it, but this is one of the primary reasons that every husband should be taking his wife out at least one day during the week just to get away from the children. You need alone time. It doesn't mean you need to go out and spend a lot of money. It could just be going to the mall and walking around, but you need to have time away. She especially. I didn't know this at the time, but when we had the twins, my wife said she was about to go crazy. Literally, she's like, all during the day, all I had was cleaning up poop and pee and talking baby talk, and that was my whole existence, was little children running around. And she said, it's no wonder I didn't feel like a wife when you came home. I just felt like a mother being hung on to. Now, with that being said, and there are a number of other reasons we could look at as why intimacy is lacking in marriage. Hopefully that will help somewhat. In love, the wife, just as the husband, is to fulfill the intimate needs within the marriage bond. I'm going to go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let me read verses 3 through 5. You'll notice it's addressed to both the husband and the wife, and that's needed because both husbands and wives within marriages are different, and so both of them need to take this into consideration. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again with Satan. Come together again, that Satan tempt you not for incontinency. Without going into great detail, what he's saying is you need to consider your spouse and their physical, intimate needs, and you need to try to accommodate those. And there's going to be a lot of give and take, and we're not going to go into any more detail on that. But the needs are going to vary from marriage to marriage and from spouse to spouse. What he's saying is you need to take that under consideration. Unfortunately, guys, due to the society that we live in, due to fornication, adultery, and a whole host of other things going on, acts of intimacy have become associated with shame and sinfulness. And I have spoken to a number of people, even those who are married, who look at the area of intimacy as being very shameful, something you don't talk about, something that's bad. I wish you could go back and change that image from the time they were very young and talk about it differently. I always tell my children, intimacy within marriage is the greatest thing in the world. It's a blessing, but it's for the marriage bond. Unfortunately, the outside world has really made it, the idea of intimacy, almost be shameful. That's not what we find in the Scriptures. In Hebrews 13:4, it says, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed, that word there is koite. It's where we get our word coitus from. I'm not going to define that word. Most of you know what that means. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. Notice the distinction. But whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. The intimate acts between a married husband and wife are God ordained, and they are needed to strengthen the marriage. Again, I looked up polls. I'm not going to go back and give you the results, but that is one of the things that is needed to continue to strengthen the marriage bond. She needs to connect emotionally before she can connect intimately. Husbands have got to figure that out. And oftentimes it takes a long time of being married before we begin to understand this. Guys, I've mentioned it before. When I first got married, I had no idea what love was. I thought I knew what it was. I didn't have any idea. And most of you who were infatuated with your wives right before you married them, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? What we thought was love is not really love. We don't begin to figure that out truly until we've been married for quite a while. Let me talk about the last point here. Her role of being a respecter. Ephesians 5:33. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. Well, in our text here, we're reminded that just as you render unto God respect, so do wives for their husband. And guys, this works both ways. But the idea of respect is to view somebody as being worthy of being treated with honor and worth. But now you've got to go back and consider the husband for a minute. For a woman to respect her husband, we have to live worthy of honor and respect. What that means is that I'm treating her the way that she ought to be treated, and that I am living my life as a godly husband. Very hard for a wife to respect her husband when he's not living the way that a Christian husband is supposed to live. The husband needs respect just as much as the wife needs love, and in general, men do need to be respected. And here's the issue, guys, and I really hate to say this. We live in a society now where godly husbands, oftentimes because of what they believe, what the scriptures teach, they are put down, they are mocked, and they are ridiculed because of their Christian beliefs. And so he may not be respected by society when he stands for what is right or when he strives to be a godly husband or man, but he ought to know that his wife loves him and respects him because he is carrying out his role as a husband and as a father, and he's doing it according to the will of God. He needs to know that he is appreciated just as much as the wife needs to know that she is desired and she is appreciated. Now, Peter describes the wife. I'm going to go back to a passage. We already looked at it once, but I'm going to look at it one more time. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 2. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. Here, we definitely see a wife who is living up to that standard, right? This word here, fear, not talking about being scared. We are talking about respect. It's the same form of the word that we find over in Ephesians 5:33. This is the type of respect that she is to have. Now, we slide on down here to 1 Peter 3, 5, and 6. We have the example again. For after this manner in the old times, the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. You see that respect being carried out in the way that she is fulfilling her role as a wife. Now, Paul, over in Ephesians 5:22, says, wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. Again, that respect is being shown in the way that she is carrying herself. Now, again, you may say, well, how exactly then does a wife respect her husband? That's probably a whole nother sermon right there. Here's one of the things she does. She allows him to be the leader of the home and the marriage. She allows him to carry out his role as a husband and a father. But at the same time, she has to realize that he's human, and sometimes he is going to make mistakes. And one more thought, and you go back and you begin to talk about Ephesians 5:33 and a number of these other verses that talk about respect. they don't put conditions on this command. It's not like you respect him if and only if he does or when. She's just supposed to respect him when he's being a godly husband. Now, in fact, the Bible teaches that's the best way really for a wife to get her husband to respond to her. And conversely, the best way for a husband to get his wife to respond to him positively is by loving her and emotionally connecting with her. And guys, these instructions are not optional. So we just spent just a little bit of time talking about the responsibility of the wife. We could have covered a whole lot more. Many of these points we could have spent much more time on. While this is not a politically correct sermon, it is needful for men who are either looking for a wife or desiring to strengthen their current marriage. And it's also needed for all women who desire to one day or to currently be a godly wife. It is a necessity for each of us to understand the roles within the marriage bond according to the Scriptures so that we can carry them out. It doesn't matter to me what society says around me. It doesn't matter to me what society thinks. We only care about what the Bible says we're supposed to do within our roles within our marriage. And so that's where we go back to understand, how do I be a good husband? How do I be a good wife? There are a lot of good articles out there you can read about on how to emotionally connect with one another. But guys, for the most part, that's already covered within our Scriptures. If we will do what we're told to do within the Bible and how we're to treat one another, everything should just fall right into place. As I draw this to a close, that would be my concern today, is that all of us are faithful Christians, but that starts by obeying the gospel. If there's anybody here who has not obeyed the gospel, let somebody sit down and study with you. I'll very quickly tell you, I'll cite the verses instead of quoting them by memory. The way that you become a Christian is the same way we find people becoming Christians in the first century. It's not complicated. There were people going around and they were teaching people about Jesus, who he was. They were teaching that Jesus was the Messiah, that he came and he established the church. And the reason they were doing that was so that people would have faith. Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing. They were teaching specifically about Jesus and the benefits that you have by accessing the blood, and that's so they would have this faith, Hebrews 11:6, so that they would not die in their sins. John 8:24. You have got to hear the gospel and you have got to believe. And yet at the same time, there's a necessity for you to repent of your sins, just as Jesus teaches in Luke 13:3 and 5, as Paul talks about over in Acts 17:30. There's a necessity for you to confess Christ, Romans 10:9 and 10. And there's a necessity for you to put on Christ in baptism for the remission of sins. Peter talks about that over in Acts 2:38. Jesus addresses it in Mark 16:15 and 16. It is how you get into Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27, and baptism is a part of salvation. You go back and look at 1 Peter 3:21. It's a burial in water, Romans 6:3 and 4, and when you come out, you are a new man. Why? At that point, you are added to the church by the Lord himself, Acts 2, verse 47. That's how simple it is to become a Christian. You hear the word, you believe, you repent, you confess Christ, and then you're immersed in water. If you're here and you've not done that, let somebody sit down and actually study with you. If you're watching this online, you've never heard that, please call us or email us. We'll study with you or find a local congregation that can. For those of us who are married, 2 weeks ago we talked about husbands. This week we talked a little bit about wives. If we want to have strong marriages, again, we need to go back. We really need to focus within the Scriptures on how it is we carry out each of those roles. If there's a way that we can help you in any way this morning, you can come forward as we are led in a song of invitation.